Here we go. Hello, and welcome to today's session, Deploy, Update, and Test Apps with No Downtime. We'll be learning about deployment slots, which are an awesome feature of App Service. And here with Sydney Andrews, who will take us through. Over to you, Sydney.
Awesome, Matt. Thank you for the wonderful introduction, as always, everybody. Really glad to see you here today. We had an amazing first session where we talked about app service, whether it's web apps or static web apps. We got to do lots of demos. And I said, let's keep that momentum going. What I like to do is talk today about deployment slots and really go drive down deeply into how we can use those deployment slots. I'll even create a fictional scenario, simple enough that you can follow along and recreate it yourself, but complicated enough that you can see some real world usage. Since we're doing this webinar, we have a Q&A panel. Please ask any questions you have and we'll try to get you an answer. I like to look at the Q&A from time to time while I'm presenting. And if I can't answer it, we have a wonderful email. That's msusdev@microsoft.com. Shoot us an email there and we will get you an answer. Again, that's msusdev@microsoft.com. If I don't get you an answer today, you can always send an email there. This won't be the last time I show this email, so don't worry about that too much. I will share that again later. Before I walk through the scenario, I also like to share this link, aka.ms, App Service at Scale Exercises. Gonna do an announcement on this in the Q&A and just let everybody know that if you want to see what the hands-on demos I'm doing are, my demo script, my notes, you can go to this link. You'll see some hands-on exercises we'll talk about. And then you'll also see my demo notes for today, exactly how I walk through every demo, the source code, all that fun stuff. So you get to kind of see underneath the engine how to do these types of presentations if you want, but it's really great if you want to recreate things. Okay, so what are we doing today? Lots of housekeeping I just did. Today, what we're going to do is we are going to walk through a fictional scenario. I'm going to use a demo node application, a really simple node application. It's going to be a node application that if you attended the session on App Service, it talks to you about the node application is just a placeholder web page. And so what I'm going to do today and talk to you about and show you interactive demos is how we can take that, set up continuous integration, continuous delivery to a dev deployment slot, push those changes from dev to a staging deployment slot, and then eventually push those changes to our production deployment slot. So essentially, we're going to have an app service plan. I'm going to do a little bit of artistic touch here. We have an app service plan with 3 web apps in it. One's going to be our production web app, the one that you commonly think of. And then I'll create 2 deployment slots, one for staging and one for dev. And I'm going to enable CI/CD for the dev deployment slot straight from GitHub. So we're going to do all of that today. It's going to be a lot of fun. I'm going to break things on purpose when I can, and hopefully I'll recover right. But the idea here is, though, I really want to walk you through a scenario that I think is going to be very beneficial. So I want to just get started. So we're going to go to the Azure portal. That's always portal.azure.com. And for the Azure portal, zoom in just a little bit tighter, I'm going to create a resource. So I'll select create a resource. And from here, I'm going to select create a web app. And for my web app, I'm going to go create it in my MS/US-Dev resource group. That's the resource group I'm going to use for all demos today. And I'm going to call this web app, let's see, Deployment with Jazz Hands. If you've never heard of Jazz Hands before, really funny story. When my wife and I were first dating, she went to a show choir conference, and they had a whole workshop on jazz hands. And I just did not know what it was until I saw a whole bunch of people in the room with their hands like this. So that's what jazz hands are. So we're going to do deployment with jazz hands. It's going to be a lot of fun today. All right, so deployment with jazz hands. I'm going to choose code as my publishing stack. I'm going to, let's do Node 14. Even though we don't need it, I'm just going to do Node 14 as my runtime stack. I might want to use it later. I'm going to deploy to a Linux instance, deploy to ECUS. If you attended our session on App Service, none of this is unfamiliar at this point. Now I'm going to create a brand new App Service plan. I'm going to hit create new. I'm going to call this Fun App Plan. Well, you know what? Fun Plan. Something simple that I won't forget when I'm running scripts. So fun plan. Going to just let it be the default premium V2, but we could change it to some other size. You're going to need a standard or better app service plan in order to use deployment slots. So I hit review and create. It's going to give me an estimated price and go over all the settings I chose, including the ones that I skipped because I skipped all the way to the end. And I'll hit create. It's going to create my web app. So it's going to be a deployment, usually pretty quick for web apps. And once this web app deployment is complete, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a slot for development and a slot for staging. So I'm literally going to just call them staging and dev to kind of mirror some of the past demos I did. So there's our app service plan. It's called Fun Plan. I can click on that resource and see we have a Linux app service plan with one app that's going to be on it. It's P1V2 as far as our tier. It looks like our web app is already done. If I go to my MS US Dev resource group, and let me zoom out just a little bit. Hit refresh. There's my fun plan. And I can either hit refresh here or I can hit the go to resource button here. Either one of those will get me to my web app. So we have a web app, has a URL. If I hit browse, it's going to take it a second, but eventually, just like I've shown with previous demos with app service, it's going to show that hosting start.html. And that's just the landing page if you haven't deployed anything yet. So I'm not going to sit here and wait for that. We've seen that before. I just wanted to call out what that's going to show. Now, from here, I know that eventually I'm going to want to deploy an application here and do some development. So I'm going to create a new deployment slot. So right now I have my production slot. If you don't have any slots, your default web app is essentially inferred as your production slot. I'm going to create another deployment slot, and I'm going to do that by selecting deployment slots in my resource menu here on the left. So deployment slots, and I see I have my production slot. I'm going to create a new one. I'm going to call this dev. I'm going to hit add. Excuse me. Now, what essentially I'm doing is I'm creating a brand new web app, but with some integration and features both in the API surface and in the portal that makes it easier for me to manage. But if you want to think about what it is really underneath the hood, I'm just creating a second web app. I just have some really cool integration features between these two different web apps. So this second web app will be deployment with jazzhands-dev.azurewebsites.net. And just like I can browse my main website, I can browse my slot too. So you notice this portal, when I go to the overview page, almost looks identical. That's because this is essentially another web app. I hit browse, and just like last one, it'll take a second to spin up for the first time. And you may say, this is taking a second to start for the first time. There's a reason I'm doing this. I'm going to get to it a little bit later. But you notice that initial deployment, especially when you first create it or you deploy some code, can take a little while. And that might be a bad thing if you have a production website where you need zero downtime, where you can't risk people coming to your website and it's spinning, or you have a server error because of deployment. We're going to get to how you can avoid that here. So we have our production website that has Hey No Developers placeholder page, and our development website that's the Hey No Developers placeholder page. So I'm going to go grab a Git repo. We're going to use the same repo we've been using in other demos, which is Microsoft Docs, MS Learn, deploy web app slots. And I don't expect you to read that tiny text or memorize that, so I'm going to pop it right here. And I'm also going to put it as a Q&A announcement. So I just put a hyperlink in the Q&A. So if you haven't been to the Q&A yet, please jump on over there. I have github.com/Microsoft Docs, MS Learn, deploy web app slots. And this is just a really fun application. We've seen it already if you attended any of our other app service sessions. Now from here, I want to clone this to my local machine. So I'm going to just be really simple here. I'm going to go copy the URI. Then I'm going to open up my terminal. Notice my terminal looks different. I'm having fun this week. So I'm going to, let's see, see what's in my downloads directory. I'm going to create a folder called deploy, and I'm going to clone this project into it. So git clone, I'm going to paste my URI for my Git repo. And if you don't put anything else, the name of the Git repo, which will be MS Learn deploy web app slots, will be the name of the folder. I want to just call this folder deploy. So I'll just say, hey, clone into a folder called deploy. Hit enter, and there we go. We can cd into the deploy folder, and we can use code dot to open Visual Studio Code in the context of that deploy folder. And you'll see it's the same node application that we know and love. We can test it locally. We can say npm install, npm run start, and then we can, it says go to localhost 8080. So I'll just control click that. And in my browser, it takes me to the Contoso Spaces web application. Nothing new yet. This essentially is a really simple placeholder site. And that's on purpose. I really want you to be able to follow the changes we make. Sometimes when I do demos, I do 1,000-line applications, and it's really hard to figure out what changes are really being made. This is purposefully simple. If you can read an index.html file and a 10-line JavaScript file, you're good to go. All right, so we have this site. I'm going to open up the terminal and stop that node server. And I'm going to do something really interesting. I'm going to go back to Visual Studio Code. So I'll have my terminal. Open in the wrong window. And I ran npm install because I need to install my node modules first before I run the application. Otherwise, it's not going to be able to find modules like Express. Let's just delete this. So if I was just cloning from Git, I would just have these files. And you notice if I want to run it, I need to run npm install first. Well, I want to think about that in the context of deployment. Let's say I want to deploy this to app service. So I have the app service extension already installed in Visual Studio Code. If you don't have it installed, you can select extensions, app service, and you'll see the Azure app service extension. You can install it yourself. And it makes deployment really easy because you can go to this app service extension and you'll sign in if you haven't signed in yet. I'm already signed in, so I don't have to worry about that. You select your subscription and you see I have deployment with Jazz Hands already there. I can expand that. I can see stuff like my application settings, connected databases. I can see my deployment slots. I have a dev deployment slot. I can even see past deployments, which I shouldn't have any yet. Now, from deployment with Jazz Hands, I'm going to deploy my current code there. So I'm going to right click and select deploy to web app. So you can say, okay, what are we deploying? You know what? I'm going to deploy my current folder. Now it's going to first give me a pop-up that says, okay, would you like to update your configuration so that it runs build on the server? Because it will improve your deployment performance. Now, what it means there is essentially if we build locally and then push to our target server, I mean, we're pushing a massive file. If we're using NPM, we're pushing all those node modules. We're doing a lot. We're doing build locally and then pushing all that stuff to a target server. That's not great, but that's an option if we want to build locally and send the full build. Otherwise, we can rely on, and if you've been to our first session, you remember this, we can rely on Oryx. Have Oryx do the build on a target server, just for fun. Remember, I do not have my node modules folder. I haven't ran npm install, so technically this application shouldn't work. Just to prove it to you, I'm going to Windows terminal, and I'm going to just say npm run start. Remember, I don't have my node modules, so it should error out, say I can't find Express. There we go. Module not found, cannot find module Express. So if I deploy this application as is and tell Oryx not to build on the target server, which is my app service, Oryx should kick back the same error. So let's just try that. So we're going to deploy the current folder. You know what? We're not going to build on the target server. It says, okay, if you deploy this application, anything that's already there is going to be overridden. You can't undo this. Are you okay with that? Yes, deploy. So it's deploying. And then I get a little option here that says, do you always want to deploy this to deployment Jazz Hands? I can actually, within Visual Studio Code, set a default target of deployment. I'm going to skip this for now. We'll come back to that later. So it looks like deployment with Jazz Hands is done. I will show you the output of our deployment. So I'll just go in and select Azure App Service output. And you'll see, here we go, starting deployment, create a zip package, copying our files over, triggering a recycle, deployment successful. Deployment with Jazz Hands reported a critical error, cannot find module Express. So if I go to app service and let's see, I was deploying straight to production and refresh, I should have an application error. Fingers crossed. Whenever you're trying to whatever you're trying to show off. And I'll slow down. I saw somebody in the Q&A say I'm speaking a little fast, and I apologize. I have a lot of demos and I ran a little bit over last time, so I'll slow down a little bit. But essentially, we have our production site, and we have an application error because it cannot find an Express module. So we got a couple options. We can either build the application locally and deploy it, and it will just run just fine. It will just be our node modules and everything, and it'll run in production. Or we can have Org Studio build. I'm going to show you both ways. So the first one I'm going to do is I'm going to have Org Studio build. So I'm going to exit out. If I go to Visual Studio Code, you see this nice little VS Code settings file. It says show build during deploy prompt. I'm going to just delete this setting file so that as far as Visual Studio Code is concerned, I haven't done anything yet. So I'm going to right click and hit deploy to web app. Going to select my current folder again. It says, okay, do you want to run builds on the target server? Yes. Let's take advantage of orgs. If we deploy this, it's going to overwrite your previous deployment. Sure. All right, we're deploying. I'm going to just let you see the output, which is it took my files, zipped them up. It has an ignore pattern, so it ignores things like the VS Code folder and node modules. There we go. Running Oryx build. Remember Oryx? Oryx extracted everything it needs to perform the build. Oryx is running on node 14.15.1. Let's see. It found a source directory. It's going to put the output of build in home site www root. It's getting ready to run npm install. There we go. Npm install. I wish I could hide this little window so I could scroll down a little faster. There we go. Ran npm install. Added 50 packages. Deployment successful. So if I go back, and I found that especially once you have a failed deployment, you may need to bounce app services. Oh, it didn't need to. Normally you may need to bounce app services, but we have a successful deployment where all the building was done by orgs. The other option is we could just build locally ourselves. Since this is a node application, it's as simple as, let me just clear my screen, npm install, and then we could deploy the web app, hit deploy, go back to our output window, and it'll just do the deployment. But this time we've done the entire build locally. I want to call out something else that's really interesting here. It says, hey, do you always want to deploy this workspace? What we're going to do is if we hit yes, and go back to Visual Studio Code, you'll notice that Visual Studio Code has the settings.json file where it sets default settings. Like for instance, what do we want to ignore? Which web application do we want to deploy to that by default? Do we have a deployment subpath? So maybe our source code isn't in a root, maybe it's in another path. So I was just showing off like 3 different ways we can deploy our code to our web application. We deploy it straight to production. So let's just jump out of Visual Studio Code right now. We don't really need it for a second. And we'll see we still have our website in a production instance. Now, from here, we can take our repo and set up continuous integration and continuous deployment to our to our dev slot. So we have our dev slot. It doesn't have anything deployed. Our production slot, it has the current version of the application deployed. So let's just go back to this picture. Let's see, I'm going to change my marker and make this a little bit easier to follow. We deployed our current version of our application, let's call it V1, to our production slot. And everything's good to go. Got a nice little smiley face, application is working. Now, what we like to do is we like to set up a dev slot, which we created earlier, and we like to set it up so that we can do deployments of maybe like a preview version of our application. So maybe we're going to preview V2 of our application and deploy it to our dev slot. So how do we do that? Well, if I go back to Visual Studio Code, I have my application. I'm going to just undo some of these changes. I don't need any of these files. They're just little files that track how the Visual Studio Code extension works. Don't need any of them. What I'm going to do is I'm in the main branch of my repository. I'm going to switch from main to preview. Now the preview branch has a couple different features. First off, what it does is it reads the site header environment variable or application setting. If it's set, it's going to use that as the header for our placeholder page. If it's not set, it's going to say transform into workplace. And just for context, our current production site says elevate your work style. So that's just the first change you see. It's going to be smart about it now. Now it's going to look for the site header, environment variable or application setting, and that's going to be our new header. And if it doesn't exist, we're going to say transform into workplace. That's the big change that we made in V2. So just for fun, let's just try it out locally. So npm install, npm run start. And now I'm going to show you the other big change we've made. So localhost 8080, I kind of just control clicked it. We flipped the theme. So it's a light theme instead of a dark theme. And we have a new header, transforming the workplace instead of the old header. So that's our two changes to Katoso Spaces V2. And I want to deploy that to our dev slot. So, and I'm just showing you on purpose so many different ways that we can deploy code to app services. Today, I'm going to try another way. So even though we deploy for Visual Studio Code, we're going to just use the deployment center here for the dev slot, just like we did in our original app services webinar. So we have our deployment center. Our source, we'll choose GitHub. And I forked this. Let's see, I have this MS-Learn deploy web app slots repo. I'm going to go ahead and fork it into my organization. So I'll fork it into my Sydney Andrews organization. It's going to take a couple seconds. And you know what? I'll refresh the Azure portal. If you notice, I actually forgot to fork it. Whoops. No worries. Here's my fork of this repo, MS-Learn deploy web app slots. Cool. I'm going to go in here, and just like earlier, just set GitHub as my deployment source. My organization, that's going to be Sydney Andrews. My repository is MS-Learn deploy web app slots. And then my branch, I'm going to deploy that preview branch. Now, it detected that node 14 was my runtime stack, so we'll keep it the same. Just like we've done, and I'm not going to walk through the whole workflow configuration like I did with the app service session. If you missed that session, we have recordings on our YouTube channel. Matt's been posting it in the Q&A, so please, jump over there if you need the link. We'll hit save, and we'll notice that it's deploying our code from GitHub using continuous integration to continuous deployment to our app service instance, just like we saw in the app service session. So we'll hit build deploy logs. We'll hit build. We'll see it starting our workflow. And you'll notice it's going to do a lot of the same things that we saw when Visual Studio Code was deploying locally. It's either going to build the application and send the application with all the node module files, or it's going to let orgs do the build. So here it looks like what it's going to do is going to do npm install on our build agent. It's going to upload an artifact with not only the application code, but all the node module files. So we'll see it's uploaded to file 237 out of 380. There we go. It's done uploading. It's going to run a new agent to do the deployment from GitHub Actions to production. And then once it does that deployment, the code will be live on app service. So take a moment to answer some Q&A questions. Hey, a couple people asked about deployments to handle database schema changes. I've only ever done deployments with database schema changes with .NET. It looks like John and Daniel asked those questions. If you don't mind, elaborating a little bit. If you're talking about .NET, we're really focused on JavaScript in this webinar series, but there's documentation on how you can actually set up GitHub Actions to do another agent and another build step for the database schema changes. Because app services itself technically doesn't have anything to do with your database schema change, and you don't have to use app services. Matter of fact, I don't want to strongly tie app services to my database at all in any way, because I might change my mind about the database. I might be running, Azure SQL database today, and then tomorrow I might be running SQL running on custom hardware. I might be running Mongo on custom hardware today, and then tomorrow I might be running Cosmos DB. So I don't like having my web front end hosting platform strongly tied to my database engine. So I saw a couple questions over that. Azure pipelines. focused on app services today. So we're not talking about Azure pipelines, but and I think Matt's has the link from the last session. We have a really great YouTube video series and webinars we've done on Azure pipelines and Azure DevOps specifically, and we go into great technical detail on how to do a lot of the same things on that platform. All right, last question, and then we'll keep it going. Somebody mentioned Windows Terminal. They said, hey, you're doing that really cool Quake trick, but Windows backtick doesn't work for me. You have to have the preview version of Windows Terminal. I don't think I said that the last time. And once you have the preview version, on the Windows Terminal blog, they tell you how to configure Quake mode because it's not enabled by default. Now, I apologize for not mentioning that last time. I was so excited because I had gotten the Quake mode of the terminal working about an hour before the webinar. I was just so excited to use it. All right, so we deployed our new development version of our site to our dev staging slot, and we have our production state slot with our older version of the site. And it's continuous integration. So if we go into our repo, let's see, we're in the preview branch, and I don't know, I'm gonna go to my index.html file and make a change. We'll say this is no longer Contoso Spaces. This is Contoso Spaces v2. Commit my change. If we go back here to GitHub Actions, we'll see a new build is queued up. If we go to App Service in our dev slot, and let's see, refresh, we'll see that a new build, in this reference in the same build, we'll see a new build is queued up there. And oh, Matt, thanks by the way for posting the links to our GitHub Actions content, and we have some Azure DevOps content on docs.com. Docs.com being pretty much the source of truth for anything you want to learn about anything on Azure Microsoft platforms. Is really great site. Okay, just checking out. Let's see. Our build's running, and this only takes about a minute or two. Looks like our build agent is already done. We're waiting for the deployment agent to work its magic. And so I just added the letters v2 to Contoso Spaces. So what I anticipate is going to happen here is when it's done deploying, the only change is that this header is going to have Contoso Spaces space v2. So wait for that deployment to finish up. It's downloading an artifact from the build job. Good old transient errors. Even though it's not my problem, it was an error in the download agent for GitHub Actions, but it ended up working out anyways. But it's hilarious because it says, hey, yeah, we had an error, but things are perfectly fine. Don't worry about it. All right, so it's deployed to my Azure web app. We give that about 10, 15 seconds. And then once it's done, we should be able to just jump over to our development slot and see that it's running the latest version of our application. And that's what we want dev to be. Dev to be the latest truth from what the developers are working on, Contoso Spaces v2. But you didn't come here to see a whole bunch of GitHub deployments. You came here to see me walk you through how to use your slots, how to do slot swapping, how to manage your application settings between slots. And that's what we're going to really focus on today. So we're going to close all these windows because I'm crazy a little bit. And we're going to go all the way back to our MSUS Dev resource group, which has, zoom out so you can see it a little bit, our app service plan called Fun Plan, our deployment with Jazz Hands web app, and then our dev slot for the deployment with Jazz Hands web app. So I'm going to just jump into our deployment with Jazz Hands web app. And if I select deployment slots, I'll see that we have our production slot and our dev slot. Now, maybe I want to have some fun. Remember I told you for the dev version of the application, this header, transforming the workplace, is a placeholder in case you don't specify a header. Just walking through the code one last time, if we go to that server.js file, it looks first for an environment variable or application setting site header. And then if it can't find that, it'll specify transforming the workplace. So we're going to just go in and go to configuration. And you can do the configuration tab on any slot, whether it's a production or a deployment slot. And when we get to the configuration tab, or pane, excuse me, not tab, we're going to create a new application setting. I'm going to call this site header. And I'm going to type in, this is a test website. Keeping it real simple. Somebody said, hey, Are there any cases where you need to stop an app service, web app before you deploy and then start again after your deployment? That's really going to depend on the framework and application platform you're deploying to it. There's some weird scenarios where you need to like bounce a web app instance, especially with like .NET framework, not the newest .NET cores or .NET 5, but in some of the older versions of the .NET framework, bouncing an application is a pretty common thing. You won't see it as much, especially when you're deploying JavaScript-based applications, when you're doing Node builds, PHP builds, or not builds, excuse me, Python builds. My Python, I wouldn't even call that a build either. I'm going through my computer science, like, is this an interpreted language or a language is pre-built? Anyways, my point is, there's not a lot of cases where you need to bounce an app service instance, and a lot of us get into the habit of that because we've done a lot of .NET development and any platform where bouncing that was very common back in the .NET framework days. Okay, somebody asked me a question about the, hey, I saw a checkbox. This is a deployment slot. I promise you, I'll get right back to that. I will have an answer for you on that. So we have our site header, and the value is this is a test website. We're gonna hit save. We updated our web app settings, and I see some Q&A questions because people are right ahead of me what I'm getting ready to show. So I'm really excited. That means everybody's really geared up to see the next steps of this demo. Refresh. And there we go. This is a test website. I kind of wish this text was a little bit darker. That's why I'm highlighting it. I'm worried about the contrast, right? This is something where I would fuss at my designer for this. Okay, so what do we do next? Well, I want to add another slot. I can go to deployment slots, hit add, and I'll be fine. But I like to show multiple ways of doing everything. So we're going to do this using Azure CLI. So AZ login to log into the Azure CLI. And remember, I'm typing the scripts kind of fast. I try to slow down, but I also am making the URL available to aka.ms app service at scale -exercises. That URL is available if you want to go see all the scripts I'm using in all the demos. And that URL is also available in our Q&A panel. All right, so I have the Azure CLI. It's open within my terminal. I have multiple Azure subscriptions, as many of you might end up having. So I need to set which subscription I want to use. So AZ account set, and I'm going to use my concierge subscription. That's the same subscription you'll get if you're using Microsoft Learn for hands-on exercises, a concierge subscription. I'm going to clear my screen just to make things a little bit easier to read. So AZ web app was AZ the command, web app is the noun for us to create a web app. And if we wanted to create a deployment to a web app, it was AZ web app deployment. If we want to create a deployment slot, it's AZ web app deployment slot. And then now we can define the verb. So create. We have a resource group called MSUSDev. What's the name of our web app? I actually don't remember. It's deployment with jazz hands. I really didn't remember. I do this so many times. Deployment with jazz hands. And then what's the name of the slot? Well, we're going to create a slot called staging. Hit enter. And it's going to create our deployment slot, which essentially is another web app. So I'll just let it go ahead and do the creation steps. Terminal real quick. I'll go back to deployment jazz hands and refresh the deployment slots list. And there's my staging deployment slot. Somebody says, hey, is there a limit on the amount of deployment slots you can have for one app service? That's a really good question. I'm not sure of the answer to that. So I'm going to show you how I would find out. So docs.com is Microsoft's documentation website, docs.com. Going to go to Azure for the product directory. I'm going to select app service. And there's tons of documentation about app service, but if you go all the way to the end, you have your more resources, you have your references. I'm going to select, I think it's resources, I'm going to select down here. And there's a section called quota information. You'll see this for most Azure services. If I select that, it's going to take me to all the limits and quotas for app service. So let's see, we have how many apps we can have an app service plan. We're running on premium, so that's unlimited. You can do all this on standard too. Let's scroll down till we can find a limit on the amount of slots, deployment slots. Because if I understand, here we go. There is a limit, so it looks like the limit is 20. If we collect it, if we connect, we can actually see that a lot of stuff I'm showing you that comes from this documentation page, and it looks like there's a limit of 20 for a single app. So I just wanted to walk you through how we find that information. One, because I wasn't sure off the top of my head, and two, because it's really useful to know how to find that information yourself. So we have our staging slot. If we go to it, we'll notice there's nothing deployed to it. It's going to take a second, but we'll see that hosting start.html placeholder page. And we want to deploy our code from our dev site to our staging site. So just for fun, this is our dev site. I'm going to, this has the light theme and it says V2. And this is our staging site. It has nothing deployed to it yet. So what we're going to do is we're going to go into our deployment slots and we're going to do our first slot swap. So I'm going to hit swap. The source is going to be dev. We're switching from dev to our target, which is staging. Now I want to pause for a second because you notice this section down here says config changes. Turns out there's some configuration settings that are different between dev and staging. If you remember, we went into dev and we set a setting called site header. The value right now is this is a test website. When we do the swap, this setting is going to go away because it's going to go to the target slot. So it's going to, new value is going to be this deployment of this application setting is not set at all. If you go to our target, which is staging, it's the opposite. It's going to get a setting called site header, which is currently not set. It's going to get a new value called this is a test website. So I hit swap and we're performing the operation. So why are we talking about this? Well, swapping a deployment slot is very important because you notice our applications are still live. There's no downtime here because what's really going on behind the scenes is Azure App Service is actually switching the routing. So it's not moving code from one deployment slot to another or one web app to another. It's just changing the internal routing. This way we can minimize the amount of downtime you're going to have when you're moving code from dev to staging or staging to prod. And somebody said a link to tutorials. Matt posted a link to our app services scale exercises, but what I think they meant is that what I just did, docs.com, Azure App Service, I believe it was deployment slots. Let's see. I'm actually trying to figure out how I found that tutorial. I went to app service limits. I selected staging slots. Here we go. And it sent us to this tutorial under how-to guides. I would have never found this. I'm gonna copy that URL and somebody posted in the Q&A, respond. I'll publish that because that was a really useful question. Somebody wanted to know, hey, how do I get to this tutorial? You say you're doing a lot of stuff in this tutorial. So I just posted that in the Q&A. Sorry about the person who asked that question. I didn't have the answer right away. Okay, so right now dev has V2 and staging has nothing. But now that we performed a swap, staging should have V2 of our application and dev should have nothing. Super weird. So somebody says, what if you want to roll a deployment slot back? You don't. You just swap it back. There's no need to actually do a rollback or undo. You just swap it back. So if I wanted to move this code back from staging to dev, I can just swap it back. No big deal. All right, so we have our code in staging and we are ready to move this from staging to production. Now, right before we got it okay, but our stakeholder said, hey, Cindy, I know you're a developer and you work on websites and stuff, but you know we can't have the words, this is a test website in production. And I'm so frustrated because I'm like, I know, I'm not sending that to production. But they had to remind me because no matter how hard you work at creating a realistic staging environment, your stakeholders will find that one piece of fake data and says, that's not going to be on a production website, is it? So we need to fix that. What I would do then is I will go to my production site. So we're going to go back to our MSUS Dev resource group and just refresh this so you can see dev and staging's there. We're going to go to our production site and we're going to go to configuration and set our site header. So new application setting, site header. And I don't know, I went to marketing and they said, hey, we have a new phrase, connecting business to space. Cool, simple, I like it. Now, somebody earlier asked me about this checkmark. Hey, what is this? We can actually make a setting sticky to a deployment slot. And what that means is that when we move things back around, like we move from staging to production, that setting will stay. in the deployment slot you're currently in. So right now we're in a production deployment slot. If I say this site header is sticky, that means no matter how many swaps we do, site header in production will always be this value. So I'm gonna hit OK, and I'm gonna hit save. Now, production right now is just the vanilla placeholder page. So this has done nothing to production, but I'm just preparing for my site code to be in production. So right now, nothing has happened to production. Staging is running V2 of our website with the light theme, and dev has nothing to deploy to it. Just for fun, I'm going to go to our GitHub repo because I'm a little bit crazy. GitHub.com, Sydney Andrews, and I'm going to go to that MS Learn Deploy Web App Slots repo and go to our preview branch, which is where we're doing development. And I'm going to update that index.html file again and just say, I don't know, V3. Hit V3, commit, and in a couple minutes, our dev site is going to have V3, our staging site is going to have V2, and our production site is going to have V1. So real quick, while I'm waiting for that build to happen, I saw a really amazing question in the Q&A. I'm going to publish it. Can we specify things like different connection strings for different slots? We want to make sure like production and dev and staging are all pointing to their correct databases. And the answer is yes. That's actually exactly why you use these settings. So for example, if I go to configuration, any setting that I want to stay. So for instance, if I have a production database, maybe that database connection string, needs to be a deployment slot setting. But other settings that I want to move back and forth. So maybe in development, we told the team to update the cache max from 500 to 5,000, and we're just testing out in dev and staging. That setting we might want to travel with this version of the application. But any deployment slot setting, we want to be sticky and not move back and forth. Okay, so let's see. We have a new version of our dev site. It should be close to being done deployed. Let's just go check on it. So we'll go to deployment slots. We'll go to dev. We'll go to the deployment center and select logs. We'll see there's a build that's in progress. Or actually it's done. So theoretically, this is my production site. It has production. This is my staging site. It has V2. My dev site should have V3. Awesome, right? And somebody says, hey, how do you access these different slots in the browser? The answer was two answers. You can either go to the overview option in the resource menu and select browse, or the URL for your slots is always going to be the same URL for your website with a hyphen in the name of the slot. So our website for this demo, and I'm going to delete this right after we're done with this webinar, but my website is deploymentwithjazzhands.azurewebsites.net. My dev site is deploymentwithjazzhands-dev.azurewebsites.net. My staging slot is deploymentwithjazzhands-staging.azurewebsites.net. And if you're a big enterprise, you can of course update those URIs and set it up so that you have your own URLs behind your own domain records that's controlled instead of using the built-in default URL. But that's just what I'm using for the demos for simplicity's sake. Okay, so we've had a lot of fun. What I like to do is move Contoso Spaces V2 has been approved for deployment to production. So I like to move Contoso Spaces V2 to production. I don't really care about what's in staging and dev right now. Dev has, well, dev latest. Staging has the version of the website I want to move. Remember, our deployment slot setting is sticky, so it should have the correct title when we go to production. So I'm going to close everything but the production website, and I'm going to go to deployment slots, and I'm going to hit the swap button again. This time I'm moving from staging to production. Now you'll notice under config changes, there are no changes to the configuration because the setting that's in production, that's sticky. So it won't be overridden by the setting from staging. So no changes on either side. I could just click the swap button and I'll be done with the demos for today. But just like with everything else, I like to show you both how to do it in a portal and how to do it with the Azure command line interface. So AZ web app deployment slot, but this time instead of the create verb, I can say swap. And I'm going to do resource group. Just need to spell it correctly. That's MSUSDev. The name is deployment. I have it down at the bottom of my screen. Deployment with jazz hands. The slot that I want to move is staging, and I want to target production. So there's another option called target slot. If you don't specify it, this command will infer production. If you specify it, you can say dev or something else, or you can manually say production, and it will understand what you mean. So me specifying target slot production or just leaving target slot option off of this command is functionally equivalent. Okay, and it's performing the slot swap, and it will let us know when it's done. Now, there's a couple more questions. Somebody says, hey, the swap preview checkbox. You can actually see what it's going to look like when you do everything, but that's something that I encourage you to go try out yourself. I found when I'm demoing it can be a little bit confusing. Like, okay, what's deployed, what's not deployed? It's something you can play around with yourself, but in a lot of organizations, they usually never use it at all. Somebody says, hey, can you show how GitHub Actions is connected to these deployment slots? Think of each deployment slot as its own web app. So in our previous session, we connected GitHub using GitHub Actions to that web app. And the only way we did that is what it did is it added a workflow, a GitHub Actions workflow with the secrets necessary to connect to our app service web app, and then the instructions to do the build in a build agent and to perform the deployment in a deployment agent. Even though we did the same thing in deployment slots, you got to remember deployment slots underneath the hood are just other web apps. So it's exactly the same. There is, let's see, somebody says, okay, since they're separate web apps, does that mean I can stop the dev site but leave production running? Absolutely. You can stop one and leave the other running. They're, again, separate web apps, so you can treat them completely different. You can perform wild experiments with dev. I've done this before, where even though I have CI/CD set up with dev, I might take just a wild experiment we want to run and manually deploy it to dev, overriding the current automated build, just to see what happens. Couple other things I want to call out, but let me just show off what happened here. So we performed our swap. So deployment jazzhands.azurewebsites.net should be running v2 with our new title, Connecting Business to Space. So that's awesome. We're pretty excited about that. We can also do other stuff here. So for instance, when we have our deployment slots, let me just go to deployment jazz hands. We can do things like traffic management, where we send percentages of our traffic to different slots. So I might have production. I might have an experiment slot where I send maybe 10 to 15% of my traffic to experiment slot just to see how it performs. We actually, in my hometown, we have a local company who does this heavily. They're constantly running experiments of new features just to see how customers respond to them using the traffic management feature. They're also doing a lot of cool stuff with Azure Functions. That's what that traffic percentage here is in the deployment slot. Somebody says, okay, we're swapping the code, but what about the database connection? That's really important, because if you want the database connection string to move with your application, all you have to do is when you go to your configuration, make sure that the deployment slot setting is unchecked. That means that configuration setting will move with the application code. If you check deployment slot setting, that means that connection string to your database will not move. So you want to make sure that's set up. Somebody says, okay, I'm just looking through this. Hey, can we set different permissions per slot? Absolutely. Every deployment slot, if you go in, is itself is a web app. So if we go to the dev slot, we can go to access control, and we might have production and staging hidden completely from our dev team. I mean, they'll still see hyperlinks to go to production here, but if they click the hyperlink to move to the production slot, it will just say, hey, you don't have access. But you can use access control, role-based access control, just like you would do with any other Azure feature, to make it so that maybe only developers can see dev, and maybe stakeholders within your organization can see just staging or prod, or maybe nobody sees prod but the ops team. You can definitely configure that. And I've said 100 times, I want to really nail that down. Every deployment slot is its own web app. So a lot of the configurations, like configuration settings, set up authentication. You can set up authentication, so you have to have an Azure AD account just to see the dev site or just to see the staging site. You can set it up so that within the Azure portal, your developers won't see anything but dev. You can set up so developers will have read access to staging, so they can see that the deployment is made it to staging, but they can't change anything about staging. You can set up so that production is completely hidden from your dev team. So lots of options here. I want to make sure I'm answering these questions. They're coming in hot and heavy. This is good. I always love it when we have really great questions. Okay, let's say we're not doing JavaScript, we're doing .NET. Will this still work? Yes, because and I'm going to try madden this up a little bit. So give me a second. But what happens when you do a deployment slot swap? And fun fact about me, I actually have a speech impediment, so it's really difficult for me to say that phrase. Let's say we are looking at prod, and then we have our URL, and then a URL -s. That's how we get to staging. When we do a deployment slot swap, no code is actually moving anywhere. That's the beauty of it. What really happens is that it just changes the internal routing. So that means that's how we get the zero downtime deployment. So it doesn't matter what's deployed there. It could be a .NET application, it could be a Java application, it could be a JavaScript application. Whatever's deployed there will be fine because nothing ever moves. There's no rebuild. There's no new build on the target server. I've done all sorts of fun experiments. One of my favorite ones is I have a .NET app in production, but then I have a React application in dev. And then I swap production and dev, and there's no downtime because, again, only the internal routing is changed. There's no code movement. So these web apps, they just get new labels, and we change the internal routing, and that's how those swaps are performed. That's how they get to the no downtime. Somebody says, okay, can I do custom domains on my like deployment slots? Absolutely. That's very common in enterprise, to use your own domains and to disable access using that public URL. Somebody says, well, and Matt's already answering this, but they're talking about TCO when you're doing like a production grade setup with app service. There's lots of great white papers and documentation on this, but think about it like this. Your unit of billing is app service plans. If your app service plan has enough compute power and memory power to have 5, 6, 7 deployment slots, then you're good to go. Because remember, you're billed per app service plan. You're not billed per individual deployment slot. So that changes things too. And Matt said, hey, any questions like that? Like if you got like super technical questions, msusdev@microsoft.com, hit us up. We have direct access to the product team, and we can definitely talk to you. And if we can't answer your question, we'll get somebody on who can answer the question. All right. Somebody says cold allergies. Yeah. Really bad allergies. Thank y'all for noticing. I was speaking really fast earlier, and I'm glad somebody called it out. Let's see. Try to make sure I hit all of these Q&A questions. All your deployment slots need to be within the same app service plan. Just somebody asked, can you have a different deployment slot in a different app service plan? No, deployment slots, they're really a convenience feature. The only things that really move is those app status environment variables. The code stays the same, just the internal routing changes. Application Insights can track which deployment slot is logging. When you set up Application Insights, it will have the name of the web app plus the suffix for the deployment slot. Let's see. The only other thing I wanted to call out here, and again, these are amazing questions everyone has, is that I highly encourage you to just go into the Microsoft Learn platform, try this out hands-on, create a standard app service plan with 3 or 4 slots, and just practice swapping them around, because the flow that you go with, whether you have CI/CD to dev, CI/CD to Q&A, staging, really depends on how your organization likes to deploy things. And deployment slots are really there just to make your deployment process and the way your team wants to do deployment that much easier, to minimize downtime so that you can have happy customers, so that you can experiment with features without bringing down your production site, so that you can make sure stakeholders in your organization have access to the latest and greatest, again, without incurring a ton of additional costs to your hosting or adding a ton of complexity. And remember, every slot in and of itself is a web app. So all the features that are available for web apps are available in these slots. So just going back to my diagram again, even though we had our production slot over here, we didn't do any CI/CD here. This is just completely manual. We did CI/CD in our dev slot, but we can do all sorts of amazing things. Like for instance, one of the things I've seen people do that's really amazing to me is using either Azure DevOps or GitHub Actions. They trigger using Event Grid on whenever a deployment slot swap occurs between staging and development. And remember, when we swap them, development is now looking at the old version of staging. So I'll just do OS for old staging, and then it triggers a brand new build from the dev branch, just so that development branch development slot will remain fresh. I've seen really cool things. One that I saw online is a team that actually automatically turns off staging whenever staging is swapped with production, because it's very rarely a moment where you swap production with staging and you still want staging to be live with the old production code. I've seen people go from staging to I can't remember the term, but they called it like a placeholder or emergency backup. So we'll just do EB for emergency backup. So they went from staging to emergency backup to production. So then production got V2 and emergency backup was still running V1. And it would just, if there's some emergency within the first 4 hours of deployment, they'll just swap back so that they can go back to their emergency backup. So lots of really cool ways. This is my way of saying, get creative, try out different ideas. You can definitely do that. I'm just looking to see if there's any more questions that I didn't get to. Somebody says, hey, if you're using a database to manage the connection with using connection pools, is that going to move with the slot during swap, or do you now point to the production database, or how does that work? That's a really good question, and that's the last one I'll answer, and then I'll try to. We have some more questions here. If I feel like I answered all of them, but if you feel like I didn't answer your question, msusdev@microsoft.com, you can just send us an email. But basically, somebody said, hey, I have a really cool situation. I have a database, and this just try to draw this out for the team, for everybody here. Here we go. I'll open my pen. I have a database. My database didn't want to draw, and I have a sticky setting. So when I do a swap, what happens to my connections in my connection pool? And that the answer is, if you were connecting using this web app at one point in time and now connected using this web app, it's going to have different connections and stuff like that. But if you set it up that your configuration setting moves with your web app, then from a database perspective, there's no reason to open new connections or change anything, because remember, your code's not actually moving. So as far as the database is concerned, it's still connected to the same application instance. It's just nothing's changed other than to the users, the routing is a little bit different. So it's a little bit of routing trickery to make this happen. Other than that, I think we could wrap things up today. The point I really wanted to nail home is that deployment slots are a really great way for you to create a modern workflow for how you move code between different web app instances while still using the power of the Orcs build engine to build your code, still integrating with GitHub Actions or Azure DevOps if you like, and still using like custom domains, authentication, all the great features of app services that make deployments really low friction. So we have 2 more sessions in this series I'm really looking forward to doing. We have a session coming up on multi-container deployments. That's my favorite one, so I can't wait to really show you how we can do use Docker Compose files to do multi-container and use just Docker straight up to do single container deployments. Excuse me. And our 4th session is all using services such as Azure Key Vault, so that we could connect from app service to other Azure services and use things like Key Vault to store the connection strings, or use service use really cool features of built-in authentication features so that we don't actually have to manually do connection strings and connections in that sort of sense. So we'll get to talk a lot about that. It's good. That's going to be really fun in our last session. Really looking forward. I really hope you all stick it out and come see us next week when we do those next 2 sessions. So thank you everybody for your time today. And Matt, I'll just hand it right back to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Lots of great questions today, and hope to see everyone back on Tuesday.